This is Critical Nonsense, our high-lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, Joey asks me about phase shifts. Phase shifts. Phase shifts. Woo!
Well. This is what a Joey sounds like. And this is what an executive producer and milk mathematician Jess Vander sounds like.
Hi, this is Jess. My new title is fun. Thanks.
It's fine. It'll be interesting to see how long milk math hangs in our conversation. Because right now it's lasting for quite a little bit.
You can't stop thinking about it. In truth, it's like, what even is milk or math or both when combined?
To the conversation last week, maybe milk math is fetch happening.
Wow, it's happening right now. We're making it
right
happen.
Before
We're making milk math happen.
Part of a balanced breakfast. Jess, do we have any housekeeping this week?
Yeah. If you're going to make Rice Krispie treats and follow the Alton Brown method of toasting the cereal, just know that a cereal that is already toasted toasts very quickly. And you just need to be careful about that before you accidentally toast an entire wokful's amount of Rice Krispies cereal. So just a PSA.
What are you toasting this cereal for?
For making Rice Krispie treats, because of, you only have 3 ingredients to work with. So you, in theory, can amp up the flavor if you brown your butter and toast your cereal. But it is difficult to do that successfully, is what I have witnessed.
Yeah, I've heard many people say to, be cautious when browning your butter.
Oh, that too. You don't want to burn your milk solids. So on the subject of milk, don't burn your milk solids. That's what I have to say.
Gee whiz. There's been so much
funny.
Butter conversation on here lately.
So true. Gee whiz.
Gee whiz. All right, Jessica.
Mm-hmm.
I have a subject this week which you are very excited about. I know from our pre-call conversations.
Oh, yes.
So I'll prime it up, and I have a number of things that I've thought about that fit into this. But on a really high level, I've been thinking a lot about sort of social and societal phase shifts. Things that happen that take us from a place where everyone is used to thinking about something in a certain way, and then based on some sort of social force or change or environmental or societal force, whatever it is, we suddenly begin to think about those things in new ways. This comes from math, the idea of a phase shift of just like a curve suddenly shifts in a new direction based on some change in the inputs. But there's a number of things happening broadly in society, based on the pandemic, based on sort of the speed of the internet continuing to accelerate changes in our abilities to compute, technology, sort of our ability to use technology in ways that is catching up with the actual technological advancement itself. And what I've been sort of wondering about is how do we deal with these phase shifts that are happening potentially at a more accelerated rate? I guess maybe that's part of my hypothesis, that these things are happening much faster. If you think about the Protestant Reformation, it took almost 50 years for that really to sort of take shape from, the onset of, or the introduction of the printing press to being able to, have literacy rates increase, and then Martin Luther's 95 Theses. Like, that was a massive shift in society within Europe, but took place over many, many years. If you compare that to the way that we're thinking about work in the US, or attitude shifting in social media, or AI, or economics, or college and schooling, changes in physics, biology, cosmology, these things are happening at such an accelerated rate. And so my question to you, I suppose, is how do we identify phase shifts, and how do we deal with big changes that are happening much more quickly and in a punctuated fashion?
Well, let's start with the first one. I think the first thing I was drawn to was that inherent in this idea of a phase shift, it sounds like there is scale. Like, you have to decide that something is fundamental enough, like big enough to totally reshape how you think about something, versus something that's more of an incremental discovery or evolution, or, small potatoes versus large potatoes on a scale of 1 to large potatoes.
To potato.
On a scale from 1 to potato, this is sort of like big. And I wonder if there has to be a part of this that's just kind of, is it recency bias, or the thing where it's just you see a lot of them and they all feel equally monumental? Are we just better at keeping track of things that are changing? Whereas, historical discoveries, some things just haven't lasted as, what we have in our collective memory as like a momentous thing. Like, is it just that in 50 years time, there will actually only be a few things that we'll know looking back at history? Oh, that made a huge difference because it opened the door to this. Like, I wonder if it's just hard to say what the relative scale or importance of phase shifts that are happening right now, and being able to identify them, because you just can't really tell until history has put it through the ringer.
Yeah. I think that's a totally fair question to raise here, right? Like, the idea of what feels like a phase shift in the moment may not be lasting or enduring in some way where it sort of makes an extended impact. I think, right, this question of like, where do we work, and, is an office required, and the changes in the ways of working feels, pretty significant, and you can sort of extrapolate it out beyond just the idea of, people stopped going into the office, and, work was sort of texturally different in the everyday experience. The impacts of removing the sort of geographic obligation at the scale that we were applying a geographic obligation to work created, what is effectively a mass migration of human beings, around the world, not just in the US, right? There was sort of a move outside of cities, or to new cities, or for people to be closer to home, or to find more space, or to find places that fit with some shared value set, whatever it was. There was a massive migration that happened over the past several years of where people were choosing to live based on removing that constraint in work. And now we're trying to sort of navigate based on that idea of the curve was in a certain position, and we were predictably understanding that if you got a job, you were expected to go in 5 days a week, whatever it was. Now that constraint is gone, and we're trying to like figure out what the renormalization is. But if you think about something like, the shift from social networking being early, Facebook, MySpace, whatever, the idea of being able to connect with people you knew and be able to track them digitally, to what we now call social media, which was this idea of projecting ideas out into the world, less about who you knew and more about sort of content consumption. Over the past 10 years, it's had a pretty significant impact on the world. Everything from Arab Spring in 2010, when that sort of real onset was happening, when Facebook changed its timeline structure and the algorithms that, into a news feed and all of that, all the way up into the 2016 election, the ways in which we were going through the moment of 2020, both with COVID preparedness and in the US, sort of the racial reckoning and the amount of activism that was happening that year, all a product of the shift from social networking to social media. And now there's sort of increasing data that seems to be suggesting that social media is starting to be on the decline. And so questions about that. But, I'm curious what you think about the idea of how much technology does or doesn't play in this, because there's a version of this where, because we're increasingly experiencing, iterative or progressive shifts in the way in which technology is being able to be introduced and rolled out and adopted, that people are sort of broadly more open to phase shifts because there is sort of a tolerance for change within the digital environment that maybe starts to cascade out into people's real lives.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just rolling with your concept of this being called a phase shift, which itself is, like, as I understand it, not like a formally defined thing. So I'm sure you could say that it's up to you, I guess, and your idea of what this is. But from what it sounds like, I feel as though, if technology is just another way of saying tools, as our tools change, that obviously has an impact on it sort of mediates the way that we interact with the world and each other and go about our existence. So yeah, for sure, that should have a really meaningful impact. And it's interesting when some of our tools dull or lose their effectiveness and we need to find a different tool or set of tools to use instead. But I wonder if what you're asking is, like, specifically the type of technology we're getting to right now, like, is the design of today's tools, to roll with this metaphor, like, making them rust quicker? Like, what is sort of the thinking behind that for you?
I think the tool metaphor, right? Like, if you're just increasing the number of tools, that is going to change the way in which you approach problems. But there's something about this too, in the idea of we think about a thing a certain way, and then relatively suddenly it shifts. And I guess sudden is itself a very relative term. To repeat myself, relatively suddenly is a relative term. But, like, if we look at college as an example, right? College went through a phase shift post World War II where a bunch of GIs were coming back. College, didn't have sort of as many people approaching that as the path towards sort of career or financial success at that point. But as part of the GI Bill, veterans were given the ability to go to college that would be paid for by the government for their service, right? And so at that point, suddenly there was a big uptick in the number of people who were attending college, and veterans, having come from the military and being very disciplined and also being a little bit more mature in terms of age than the traditional college students at that time, were extremely successful. Fast forward to sort of current times, and college has, up until relatively recently, been seen as the expected path of, biggest means of increasing your, personal financial success in society. However you want to describe that. But there's increasingly this orientation, and Gen Z is sort of having attitude shifts around how they perceive college, of whether college is necessary and how do we think about college. And the internet provides you all of this access to information, right? You can, if you want to go into coding, there are coding classes. If you want to, learn how to become a, X, Y, or Z thing, there's a lot that you can get from the internet, from smart people who have provided information that can teach you how to do things. And suddenly we're going through this moment of contending with, like, wait, do we actually believe that? And that's sort of demonstrated in a bunch of ways around the edges, right? These, lawsuits that are happening and going in front of the Supreme Court around affirmative action, and the ways in which colleges are assessing the potential of students, and is the SAT right? And a lot of schools are now trying to push away from. There's just a massive reevaluation, and that phase shift is sort of in process. We sort of had fallen into a normal curve of how we would think about the idea of college, and suddenly that's being reevaluated, and you have to sort of renormalize into some new agreed upon assessment on what is the value of college and how should people approach it, in the same way that we're in that phase shift right now of, like, what is the new way of working, and do people need to be in person, and what does an office look like, and is it hybrid, or is it fully remote, or do we go back to, right? There's this, like, messy period where a new normal hasn't yet been formed, and it feels like we're in that messy spot in a bunch of different, right? Like the list I had like office work, social media, AI, specifically AI, like with the orientation towards GPU-based computing and the explosion of power in GPU versus CPU computing and chips. Like economics is going through a bunch of phase shifts right now, because traditional things like the beverage curve, as an example, are really struggling to make any sense of the current sort of economic turmoil we're in. College is going through this. Physics is going through a massive shift in, is space-time fundamental. Cosmology is going through an explosion with the JWST demonstrating tons of things that we didn't know, and sort of calling into question things that we thought were sort of certain. Biology is going through this with RNA vaccines or xenobots and biological engineering. It's like so much, right? Like, and this is like a list that I came up with in like 5 minutes of just like, what could I think of that was going through this? And so it's far from exhaustive, but it feels like, even the idea that people have been trying to push of Web3 is a demonstration of people trying to like essentially like force a phase shift, right?
Potentially, I don't know enough to say that, though. I get the gist of like, people are like, so is it happening yet? Like I do. If you see any of the internets, like, even just talking to you sometimes, I'm like, yeah, is it? I don't know.
Yeah.
It feels like, I mean, a couple of things come to mind. One is the Moore's law of it all, of like the pace of growth and technology is ever increasing. And so there's more stuff that we're, get it, uncovering.
Yeah.
But all of it also, another thing, even as you were running through that list, it just reminded me of this visual of a loose flap. Like whatever loose flap comes to mind, just like some sort of loose, it's like when you know when sometimes you have a spice container with a little seal and some insane person has only peeled back half of it, and it's sort of that and it sort of has a memory, so it stays sort of upright in a way even when you unscrew the lid that covers it, sort of like half flap open, and it's sort of like flapping in the wind. Is that feeling to me is what you're describing in so many different areas of study and fields and cultural trends, customs, social attitudes about the way that we do things. And like there are some people who are probably louder than others who are like picking at the flap and they're like, all right, let's take it off already. And other people are like, no, it's not, it's not time. I like using this to scrape off the spoon and level out the baking soda. I'm mixing up too many of these different containers, but they all have flaps, and you get the idea.
Yeah, I think the flap idea is sort of interesting in like the like equivalent of muscle memory, where things like keep in these like phase shifts. There is sort of an orientation until you like really cross the line and something has stabilized to like there's like it wants to go back to the way that it was.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, there's a point of no return. Any lid has a point of no return. Like when you open a can and you are like most of the way there, but you don't want to take it off, but then you push it back and then it falls off anyway, and you're like, well, it's too late now. It's another loose flap.
It's too late now. Yeah. I mean, it is like how these things happen. And I mean, I guess like, going back to some of the ideas we've spoken about this year, like there is that sort of assembly space idea of like where we have these concepts that we will talk about that exist in our minds and sort of start somewhere and start to grow in conceptual space where more and more people know them, are thinking about them, adopting them, starting to use them in conversation, sharing them, right? And they're trying to grow and become bigger than potentially like a concept that they were supplanting. But until you cross some tipping point, there is still like that battle between different ideas. And you're seeing it right even in like simple ideas, or maybe not simple ideas, but like narrow ideas, right? The idea of life in the universe and other life, and people willing in academic or elite circles to entertain ideas, like with Oumuamua and some of the stuff that we spoke about of scientists being like, listen, that may be sort of an interstellar body. It certainly is an interstellar object. Like, what was it? We don't know. We should at least explore it through the lens of like it was a crafted object, right? Like that idea. And New York Times publishing reports and sort of increased conversations about UAPs. Suddenly we've gone, or we're in that phase shift of like, okay, like it's increasingly becoming okay for serious people, in quotes, to entertain these ideas of extraterrestrial life or exploring it, as long as it's through the lens of science, right? Like that seems to have been a phase shift where increasingly people are willing to entertain those ideas within sort of the realm of, in quotes, science, right? But there is like that like sort of tendency or fear to be like, well, maybe like, is this safe? Like, can I dip my toe in, right? Like there is sort of a momentum that happens, and it feels like in some cases it's an idea, in some cases it's a bit of technology, right? You brought up Moore's Law. I happened to see a quote this morning from the CEO of NVIDIA talking about like Moore's Law is dead. We can't redouble the scale of compute that's happening on an individual chip anymore, like put a nail in it, like a sort of aggressive quote from the CEO of NVIDIA. But then in the comments, people were showing like, okay, an individual chip is not redoubling, but Moore's Law is ultimately about like computational speed and power, and the curve that's related to GPU processing and the amount of processing that can happen by using graphics processing unit, I think is what GPU stands for. Like it's a graphics chip instead of a traditional CPU chip. The curve actually has accelerated in the amount of computational power that's happening by just using multiple GPUs in concert. That's what neural networks, when you hear someone talking about neural networks in computing, are almost always sort of a series of GPUs working in concert together. And so like those ideas change, but we're dealing with all these conversations about AI and ChatGPT and other sort of topics du saison, but like the explosion that's happening and what we're contending with AI right now is like it'll be almost a forced phase shift, right? Like at the end of the day, if no one is actively stopping this like computing advancement, it is going to reach a point where suddenly like all of our technology is going to feel radically different by the amount of computational power that any device is going to have access to, even if it is sort of cloud-based access.
Because the tools are multiplying.
Yeah,
Did I nail
it is interesting. Like your tool example is sort of, there can be tool-based phase shifts, but there also seems to be sort of conceptual or idea-based phase shifts, and maybe it's worthy of parsing those things apart, right? What changes in the way that we sort of view or think about something conceptually as a society, where some of these work-based conversations, maybe tool-enabled certainly, but ultimately feels like more about like what do people want for their lives and
right.
What are they trying to pursue? Feels more it feels like it's in the idea space versus or even like college feels like it's sort of more in the idea space, whereas AI or some of the things within physics or sciences maybe feel more maybe combination, whereas like economics feels like a lot of it is, maybe that's combination too. Like there are some of these that feel like very neatly like this is just how we're thinking about things. Like college has changed in how it functions, but like the shifts in how people are thinking about that are not as much based on like suddenly a new tool set is available, maybe. Although I guess we're talking about like internet access to data and knowledge. Maybe all of them are a combination of these two things. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I think you're onto something.
Do you have any, before we wrap it up, any things that you feel like you're noticing? It can be like silly things, like maybe there's a phase shift in vanilla, but
chip flavors. Well, first of all, there is a phase shift in vanilla. I was actually, as you were talking, checking. Seems like, according to this very not obviously, what's it called when oh my goodness, peer-reviewed. It's not a peer-reviewed. I'm not certain it is, but something that's saying in 2021 there's a 9% increase in vanilla-flavored food and beverage launches. last year.
Okay.
And who knows what's happened in 2022. But honestly, if this happens without me, I'm just going to be so upset. 'Cause I called it.
I sent you that. I sent Jess a tweet earlier this year of someone basically on her corner about vanilla being underrated and overlooked, and, you know, chocolate getting too much love and all of that. And the whole thread of comments underneath was Jess's people just being like, hell yes, let's talk about vanilla. Vanilla is the greatest. Let's start a revolution. Like, you know, I was like, you need to unite these people.
Yeah. The way to unite them is by providing them with the perfect encapsulation of this product, yet to be determined. But exactly, one of these days, maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but at some point, you know, the people will have what they want. The flap will be unveiled, and soon everyone will see that I've been right this whole time. Vanilla is superior.
Yeah, I don't know what the equivalent of the next Protestant Reformation will be, or if, you know, just simply society in general is less stable and predictable because there are many more of these changes happening. And so none of these individually will feel as radical as something like the Protestant Reformation or, you know, the Enlightenment or other periods of time. And at the same time, it feels like so many of these things are on the table and feel like we're like reevaluating so much as a society. In some ways, it feels exciting and new to me. And like this idea of a phase shift, ultimately, we talk so much about progress as a company, is exciting because so many of these things are progressing in at least what appears to be today positive directions. And so I want to think about it more, but I'm optimistic, if I can say that anyways. I don't know if you want to try to wrap this conversation up.
Joey came up with the idea called a phase shift, like the sinusoidal curve reference. And it speaks to the general category of when we're thinking about something one way and it totally gets turned on its head. And I don't know. I don't think we've come to a conclusion of whether it just feels that way right now or whether it actually is that we are unearthing more than ever or shifting things more than ever before. But it might just be that time will tell, and the side of, you know, what sticks or what doesn't stick will rest in the hands of fate.
Our collective assembly space.
Yeah, so there you go.
There you go. All right, well, let's all, at the very least, we can come up with a new song and dance called The Phase Shift, which I think we need to recruit Aaron into the creation.
It's like the electric slide becomes a little more wobbly.
Do the phase shift.
Yeah. Boogie, woogie, woogie. Yeah, so you can't just like totally reuse the electric slide. You'd have to make it your own. So that's your next task.
Yeah, just
if you choose to accept it.
Make it like a chopped and screwed version of the electric slide or something. I don't know. All right, well, thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Joey. This was fun.
Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production.
Brought to you by Boogie Woogie Woogie. That's the dance.
As always, we'd like to thank our executive producer and square dance instructor, Jess Vander.
We'd also like to thank sound engineer and human, what would you call someone who presents the cherubic Babis? Well, you know, that guy, Alex Contel.
Baby Wrangler.
Yeah.
We'd like to thank our programming coordinator and resident chopper and screwer, Les Jacobs.
And also thanks to our production crew, the fully secured Flaps, Sarah Gilbert and Nora Mestrich.
As always, thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Len.
Special thanks to the Terry Fold song and the Foldy Flaps. If you haven't heard it, you should just go listen to Terry Folds on whatever music platform you use. It's from I don't do I want to endorse it? I don't know. I think it's funny.
Well, now you're halfway through
Enter at
endorsing
your own
it,
risk.
so.
Yeah, enter at your
You're
own
like,
risk.
wait, a
There
little
are swear
regret
words.
halfway through.
Yeah,
Halfway through,
there
I'm
are
not
swear
sure
words,
that I want to
but
recommend this.
If you're interested in crude songs with like legit indie pop beats, then it's right up
There
your
you go.
alley.
Then you can enjoy it. Right.
Do you have any special
That's it.
thanks this week, Jess?
That's the one thing we're going to thank. You know what I'd love to thank,
Terry Fold.
actually, is Big Chip for moving beyond flavors such as salt and vinegar to more advanced evolutions of flavors, such as ranch. No. What's
Pickle.
another flavor that's more advanced? Yeah. Pickle chips, but not.
I think there
Chips
was
of
one that was like
pickles.
Korean barbecue at one point.
Yeah, honey butter chip. Just so many evolved forms.
Yeah.
So that's what I have to contribute.
That's great.
Nothing
Well-
much. Just a little commentary about snacks. That's all I have. We thank Joey
All right.
for being the smart one.
Yeah, something like that. All right, love you. Bye.
Okay, bye. All right. Also, at some point in that whole process, Abu was like, Jessica! from the other room. So I have to go check on what that was.